When I started this channel, I had the full intent of going the route of somebody like Inspiring Philosophy and keeping my denomination, my own personal theological beliefs, kind of hidden as much as I could. However, I've realized that that's actually going to be kind of impossible when you're covering subjects like this, and I honestly don't know how Inspiring Philosophy manages to keep his denominational beliefs secret. So because of that, I wanted to go ahead and use this video as a kind of way to reveal my denominational beliefs, but also to react to a video that is covering my denomination and some of the topics surrounding it. So to go ahead and kind of make the reveal, I am currently a member of the Churches of Christ. And the reason I really made sure to say currently there is something I'll get into in a little bit. You'll kind of see throughout the video why that is the case. So, because of that, in this video, I'm going to be reacting to Ready to Harvest 2-minute video on the Churches of Christ and explaining them there. So as you can see here, this is a 2-minute video. However, he has a longer, I think 24-minute video where he goes more into depth. And so I'm not going to be reacting to that one, and there's a reason for that. I would like everybody to go actually react to that on their own, watch it on their own, rather than having me react to it. I figured I'd rather cover this shorter term one to make the video shorter and also give some deeper explanations and point out some little things here and there. So with that being said, let's get started. I'll make sure to try and pause at the right moments. He talks pretty fast because obviously he's trying to fit a lot in 2 minutes. So we'll see how we do. But with that, let's go ahead and get started.
Church of Christ congregations affirm basic Protestant Christian beliefs, although they often wouldn't like to be called Protestant or be called a denomination. Typically, they view their congregations as just the modern-day representation of the church of the first century.
Okay, yeah, so starting it right off there, I do know a lot of people who are fine with the Churches of Christ being called Protestant because they do recognize that, okay, the Churches of Christ movement did really get born out of the Restoration, from most prominently Alexander Campbell. So the Stone Campbell movement is really where it came from. And so I know a lot of people who are perfectly fine with calling them Protestant. But also a lot of people don't like being called Protestant because they don't like sola fide. So there's a lot of Churches of Christ people I know of who actually affirm more of a Catholic view of salvation in terms of works. Obviously, sola fide is mainly about faith as opposed to works rather than faith as opposed to something like baptism, because you have a lot of people who affirm, a lot of Protestants who affirm baptismal regeneration, but also affirm sola fide. And there's explanation to why that is, because it's sola fide, not sol fide. But that's a deeper explanation for a different video. But that is very true. We don't like being called, or a lot of people don't like being called denominations. I am one of the few members of the Churches of Christ who actually do call the Churches of Christ a denomination, because they are. And it's just whether or not they like it or not, they are called a denomination. Actually, Ready to Harvest made a fantastic video about this a few days ago, actually last week, a couple weeks ago, I can't remember, but where he went over why he calls the Catholics a denomination. And that made a lot of people upset because obviously Catholics don't like he calling a denomination because they believe they are pre-denominational. The Church of Christ believe it for the same reason. But all of the reasons he pointed out for why he calls Catholics a denomination also apply to the Churches of Christ. And he also pointed that out at the very end of the video where he said, hey, we don't like being called a denomination, the Catholics don't, but I also call all these other people a denomination who also don't like it. So yes, that is very true. Most members of Church of Christ don't like being called a denomination. I personally call us a denomination. I do not care personally. But let's continue on now.
Bible is believed to be inerrant, and there's a strong belief in the Bible alone, no creeds or confessions. Despite that, Church of Christ congregations do have certain beliefs that they all affirm.
Okay, yeah. So I'm going to stop it right there because I think I'm just about to go on to like baptism stuff. Very quickly, very true. Everybody's very strict on the Bible only, and that there's no creeds or confessions within the Churches of Christ. Why is this? Well, I think it actually comes from a misunderstanding within the members of the Churches of Christ about what creeds are and confessions are. I hear a lot of people within the churches have absolutely no idea why creeds exist or why confessions exist, and the reasons that they do give are way off the mark. And it's kind of sad to see. I don't necessarily think that doing something like reciting the Nicene Creed at church is essential for a service. I don't think that's the case, but it is sad to see that the Church of Christ have departed from accepting creeds of the early church, especially like the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed. And that thing right there at the bottom, we do have distinct beliefs. That is kind of one of the reasons why I say that we are a denomination. Now, I'm going to explain that probably at the end or as we go out some more, but let's continue on now.
They have two ordinances. First, baptism, which is by immersion for believers and taught as being the time one receives forgiveness of sins and salvation. The second ordinance is the Lord's Supper, which is observed weekly on Sunday, typically open to all believers.
Yeah, okay. So quickly there, baptismal regeneration, very, very important belief within the Churches of Christ. But do not practice infant baptism. That's what's very strange about the Churches of Christ. They have this idea of you must be able to profess faith in order to receive baptism and in order to receive the salvation that comes with baptism. They say salvation is necessary, but believe that if an infant dies without being baptized, which they don't do, that the infant will go to heaven. So that tells me that no, you don't believe that baptism is essential. You don't believe baptism is necessary. You believe that baptism is a very important step for salvation, but that it only applies to adults or people who can profess belief. So at that point, baptism wouldn't be universally necessary. Baptism would only be necessary for a set group of people. And adding on to that about the Lord's Supper, something to add on to their Lord's Supper section is that it says for all believers. I guess that means it depends on what you mean by believers. I've never personally been to any of the Churches of Christ that believe that somebody who hasn't been baptized can partake of the Lord's Supper, which that was the same in the early church. That is actually something they get very accurate. In the early church, only those who had been baptized could receive the Eucharist, or could receive the Lord's Supper. And another thing to add on here is that the Churches of Christ, I have never met a single person who affirms the real presence in Lord's Supper or in the Eucharist. Earlier I mentioned that I am currently a member of the Churches of Christ. That is actually why. To me, the real presence in the Eucharist is an absolutely vital and really, really important thing in theology, and I can't see myself remaining in a church or in a group, a denomination that believes that the real presence of the Eucharist is false, or that the Eucharist is simply a symbolic thing, because I think it's clear throughout Scripture that it's not. But obviously people debate about that, and to me, being in a church that doesn't believe that, it's really, really hard. And so currently I'm exploring other denominations. I don't want to just jump ship real quick, without doing my due diligence in inspecting and researching other denominations. But that's why I specified currently. That's not the only doctrine I have issue with, but that's probably one of the most important ones that I have an issue with. But anyways, go back a few seconds. We'll carry on. I don't want to talk about every little detail because we'd be here forever if I was to do that. But let's carry on now.
Salvation is by hearing God's word, believing it, repenting of sin, confessing Jesus Christ, and being baptized for the remission of sins.
All
A
accurate.
Christian can fall from grace and once again be in an unsaved condition.
Okay, so I'll stop there real quick for that very small thing to notice there. Yes, the Churches of Christ do not believe in once saved, always saved. However, we are typically very careful on how they word that. I've heard people word it differently. I typically word it as you cannot lose your salvation, as in God kind of like lost it or something, or forgot you or something. I don't. A lot of people have issue with that. I personally word it as you yourself can forsake your salvation. You don't lose it, as in God forgot about you or something, but you yourself can forsake your salvation. So it's a small note there, but yes, the Churches of Christ do not affirm. I've never met a certain person, a single person who's affirmed once saved, always saved.
There are actually at least two branches of the movement that are relatively separate. The one we're talking about is called Churches of Christ, but there's another similar group called Christian Churches and Churches of Christ.
Yep.
The Churches of Christ have only a cappella music and worship and hold a principle that things that the Bible doesn't explicitly approve for worship should be avoided, while the Christian churches and Churches of Christ allow instrumental music and other things in worship that the Bible neither explicitly approves nor forbids.
Yeah, so I'm sure he's about to continue on now, but yes, this is one of the big things I'm actually a huge fan of the Churches of Christ for. Musical instruments were not found in the first century church, and they were not really found in the early church at all. They didn't actually come until later when organs were allowed in worship. I do believe this is 100% accurate. Now, a lot of people within the Churches of Christ tried to make a biblical argument for the lack of musical instruments. I don't think that's a good idea. When you examine the Greek of the one passage they typically use, it's kind of weak in arguing that you cannot have musical instruments, because one of the words is the word for psalms or psalmos. If you look into the meaning of that word, it is spoken expecting that musical instruments will be present. However, I think that we can use church history to argue that that's not the meaning. So I think using a strict hey, look at this word against this word argument for why musical instruments should not be used is not a good argument. In my opinion, you have to pair that with church history. And church history, which obviously this is outside the Bible, which is why a lot of people out of the Churches of Christ don't like arguing from it. But church history does provide a pretty clear set in stone, hey, musical instruments were not used. Which is why something like Eastern Orthodoxy, to me, is really attractive. For other reasons as well. I'm also a monarchical Trinitarian, which is different than a lot of people in the Churches of Christ. But the Eastern Orthodox position is really appealing to me, especially on that, and especially on other things like the early church not having pews or standing up during worship and small things like that. And one other thing I'll mention is he mentioned that pretty much only sticks to what the Bible says. There's a saying within the Churches of Christ, you may have even heard it outside of it, it's very popular, which is, where the Bible speaks, we speak, and where the Bible is silent, we are silent. And that is a quote from one of the restorationists, people in the Restoration movement. I'm going blank. It may have been Stone, may have been Campbell. I'm not sure. One of them two, maybe. But that is a very, very prominent saying. I don't agree with that saying personally, which is another reason I may be moving around, because that's a very strong principle to live by in the Churches of Christ. But that is an important thing to note when you're studying the Church of Christ, why they do some of the things they do and why they believe some of the things they do. And I think one of the problems people have with that idea is that, okay, yes, for the Bible speaks, we speak, and such, so and so, whatever, that's fine, but by whose interpretation of the Bible are you following? And so that's where the issue comes. You even have this issue within the Churches of Christ whenever it comes to things like whether or not you should have a kitchen in the church building or in the church. Yeah, a lot of churches have split because of that. I had my home congregation split because of that very reason. That's something so simple and seemingly meaningless. Whether or not you should have a kitchen in a church building completely split a congregation, and they have not been able to reconcile since. That's pretty wild. And the last thing I will add, and earlier I mentioned that they have distinct beliefs, or he did, and I said I would make a note of that later. One of the things I want to note is that typically, and this is another example of how they are a denomination, the Churches of Christ will kind of declare anathema on another Church of Christ if they use musical instruments. So, for example, I know if a Church of Christ, you can find them pretty much everywhere though, in Arizona, that uses musical instruments. And I actually showed this to some people, and I was like, hey, guess what denomination this is? And they all guessed, oh, maybe a non-denominational, kind of, rock bandy thing, or a non-denominational Baptist, or they kind of were trying to guess around there. And I revealed to them it was a Church of Christ. It was one of the Churches of Christ. And quite a few people said, well, they're not a real Church of Christ. And so, again, you run into that issue of, okay, if you're going to set these borders of beliefs based on your own interpretation, or the interpretation of these select groups of people, then you are declaring a sort of denominational barrier between you and these other people. And to say that you aren't, and that you aren't a denomination, is false, because you're saying that this congregation is not in line with using that name in accordance to your congregation. So you are setting a barrier between, hey, we have to declare these people anathema. And I've heard some other pretty prominent examples as well. I heard one recently that absolutely shocked me and I completely disagreed with. I won't go into the specifics here, but yeah, there are some examples of people declaring stuff like that. And that's another reason I really don't agree 100% with this idea of we can declare denominational anathemas upon these people, but also say that we aren't a part of the denomination. So anyways, I'll stop rambling and I'll go ahead and carry on for the see what the next point is.
Most churches of Christ teach abstinence from drinking alcohol. A few other beliefs of churches of Christ is that they don't teach tithing, although they do believe in financial giving. They don't have formal church membership where a person joins the church. And on end times, they hold to the amillennial view.
Abstinence from alcohol, yes, but not as prevalent as you may think. However, what's very sad is a lot of people who believe that you can drink alcohol within the Church of Christ kind of keep it secret because they don't want to be kicked out or looked down upon or anything from other members of Churches of Christ. This is a little bit where you see some hypocrisy that a lot of people do point out within the Churches of Christ, is that there is nothing in the Bible that explicitly says you cannot drink alcohol, and there are verses that actually do promote the drinking of alcohol. And there's a lot of times where Christians or church members of the Church of Christ completely make something up in regards to whether or not you should or should not drink alcohol. I think it's pretty clear about what the Bible says about alcohol. Drink in moderation, don't get drunk. Simple as that. A lot of people in the Church of Christ cannot stand that, and I have been looked at down upon, and I've been really people looked at me differently when I expressed that view. Don't tithe, that's very true. We don't really have tithing in the Churches of Christ. No formal church membership. That is actually varies between congregations. My original congregation did not have this necessarily, where you had to, join the church or anything. However, another congregation I know of does actually do this. You do request to join, and then suddenly out of the directory, they announce it at the front and everything. There's no real voting in that I've seen, but there is actually some formal church memberships within a congregation. That kind of varies between them, I think. And all millennial, yes, typically I am a post millennialist. I actually don't. I'm different from them there. I believe in post millennialism. But I do know that most churches of Christ are very against pre-millennialism, so that's something to note.
Churches have elders that govern and deacons who have a role of service to the church. Women may not be preachers. There are around 13,000 Church of Christ congregations in the United States.
Eldership, yes. Elders are very important within church. Deacons, very important with the church. They follow the guidelines found in, I think, 1 Timothy to declare whether or not somebody is worthy to be an elder or a deacon. No women pastors. Yes, very, very true. Usually very strict. However, I actually do know of some churches of Christ around me who do have women pastors, women preachers. So that is something to note.
One thing that Church of Christ congregations are very strict about is being autonomous. Unlike denominations with Presbyterian or Episcopal polity, there's no overarching authority, no central organization. That's called congregational polity. In fact, there's another denomination that held to this core tenet so strongly that they took their name from it, the Congregationalists. Click over to the next video for a quick overview of Congregationalists, or if you want to find out more about the Church of Christ, click here.
This is another video it does have on the Church of Christ. There's another 24-minute one. If you look him up, you'll find. But yeah, that's the end of the video. I just want to make a few last points. Yes, that last part is very true. Autonomy is very, very important. But a lot of Churches of Christ still do reach out and do events with this church or go to this big conference organized by this church. Another thing that's not included in the video, but I do think is very, very important, it needs to be said. Churches of Christ tend to be very, very negative, I'll say, towards denominational Christians. So, a member of the Churches of Christ is going to view somebody who is a Baptist or a Presbyterian, Catholic, whatever, as being in sin because they are a part of the denomination. They believe that denominationalism is a sin. I believe this is incredibly hypocritical. I don't think that this works at all. I think you can make the argument that schism can be sinful, but the argument that denominationalism in itself is a sin is something that was foreign to a lot of the Restorationists. They didn't like it, but I don't think they declared them as a sin. One of the Restorationists, may have been Stone, may have been Campbell, again, I can't remember exactly, said that although we are a member of those saved, we are not the only ones saved. A lot of the Churches of Christ have departed from that. You will find people within the Churches of Christ say, if you are not a member of the Churches of Christ, you are not saved. And that is very, very unfortunate. Now, this does seem to be an older group of people, and as Gen Z and the younger generations start to kind of take over the churches, that vibe is shifting. That opinion is shifting. I personally don't believe that at all. I believe the Church of Christ are a denomination. I believe that a Catholic is saved. I believe an Orthodox is saved. I believe that a Presbyterian, Methodist, Baptist, I believe they are all saved. Do I think that some are further from the truth than others? Yes, absolutely. There is no reason that I can ever judge somebody because of a denomination they are in when I am part of one that I actually don't believe is 100% accurate. I don't think there's any denomination out there that is 100% accurate either. Another thing to note quickly is that typically, this is something weird. Sometimes churches of Christ will not accept your baptism if you are from a denomination. I know somebody very close to me who was told they are baptizing within a church of God. They were told that they were not saved because they were baptized in a church of God and not in one of the churches of Christ. Very, very, very unfortunate, and scared them enough because they were, still young enough to have to think about this stuff a lot, that they went and got rebaptized when they did not need to. This stuff does happen. And this is one of the reasons I really do believe that the Churches of Christ are dying out as quickly as they are. Because a lot of member of Church of Christ have no idea about church history. They strawman things. They say things like Catholics worship Mary. And you ask them, well, how do you know that? And they'll say, oh, because they pray to her or something, without knowing the history of the reasons why Catholics do that, or why the Orthodox do that. There are a lot of issues within the Churches of Christ. I do agree with quite a bit of their teaching. I believe in baptismal regeneration. I don't necessarily believe that you have to be... I necessarily don't believe in believer's baptism. I do think that infant baptism, the more I study it, and the more I study baptism in general, is valid. I don't agree with them on the symbolic view of the Lord's Supper. I agree with him that premillennialism is not true. I agree with them that musical instruments probably shouldn't be used in worship. I agree with him on quite a few areas, but that doesn't mean that I can't be critical, because I think the moment we stop being self-critical of our beliefs or self-critical of our position is a moment when true truth-seeking ceases. And so, yeah, that's all I have for you guys today. I hope I covered enough here. I'd highly recommend both of his other videos on this. He has quite a few other videos on the Church of Christ, or at least where he mentions them. So, highly recommend Ready to Harvest in general. An absolutely fantastic channel. Very knowledgeable and very, very easy to get into and really explore. So, that's all I have for you guys today. If you have any questions about the Churches of Christ or about anything in general, please leave them below, and I'll be happy to either make a video responding to some of them, or just leave a comment if I can leave an adequate response within a comment. But that's all I have for you guys today. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. It means the world, and I'm really just trying to get better. I'm sorry that my upload schedule has been wonky. If you care about that, I'm really trying. It's just crazy busy right now. But that's all I have for you today. So thank you very much to everybody watching. Please like, comment, subscribe if you'd like, and I'll see you later. God bless.